A small number of. A small number of. How to use a small number of in a sentence. Hi everyone. I'm Heslam from www.translatein.com. If you have been looking for a small number of in sentence examples with audio pronunciation, then you are right here. So let's get started. He won by a small number of popular votes. We found only a small number of customers in the store. Mopar also designs and builds a small number of customized vehicles. Mopar also designs and builds a small number of customized vehicles. A substantial rural area with a small number of electors is also included. A substantial rural area with a small number of electors is also included. School being over, there were only a small number of pupils in the playground. Serbian soldiers and a small number of civilians arrived in Bizerte on 3 occasions. Serbian soldiers and a small number of civilians arrived in Bizerte on 3 occasions. It is a great thing to start life with a small number of really good books which are your very own. The authors state quite categorically that the female members of only a small number of species also sing. It is estimated that only a few hundred pandas remain, with a small number of them being raised in zoos in China and abroad. It is worth remembering one of the important lessons of the buck story. A small number of zealous advocates can have an impact on the law that defies both science and conventional wisdom. We seem to inhabit a universe made up of a small number of elements, particles, bits that swirl in chaotic clouds, occasionally clustering together in geometrically logical temporary configurations. But a small number of them did. From a small number of extremists. A small number of people in their localities. Guided by a small number of simple principles. A small number of girls were pulled from the main group. And will be completely everywhere in a small number of years. But let's think about this. How can you make a small number of neurons do a lot? Instead we get a small number of projects with little substance on drawing them. There is a small number of tertiary education. What? A large grassy area with a small number of trees is called a savanna. Why is it more economical for scientists to study a small number of species? They are not teratogens, but they may cause cleft palate in a small number of babies. Visual stimuli are considered elegant if a small number of colors and stimuli are used. He is mentioned in the Palermo stone inscriptions among a small number of kings of Lower Egypt. In a pride of lions there are related females, their young, and a small number of adult males. While the World Bank represents 186 countries, it is run by a small number of powerful countries. Similarly, some eukaryotic organelles contain a remnant circular chromosome with a small number of genes. Today Islam is practiced by a small number of people, including virtually all the Hui Chinese living in Zhejiang. If you want to get very specific, a covey is a pair of mature birds that have a small number of babies with them. When the Olympian won his 10th gold medal, he joined a rarefied body composed of only a small number of athletes. Mounted on this board is some simple power circuitry and a small number of surface-mounted integrated circuits LRB XRRB. Real tennis is still played at a small number of active courts in the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States and France. Until the mid-1980s, television programming in most countries of the world was mainly done by a small number of broadcast networks. However, a small number of people within Bosnia and Herzegovina declare themselves Bosniak but are not necessarily Muslim by faith. Why DNA studies tend to imply a small number of founders and an old population whose members parted and followed different migration paths. As part of Polydor Records UK, the label will concentrate on a small number of pop acts and will complement the reactivated fiction rock imprint. A small business is a business that is owned and maintained by a private owner. They have a small number of employees and a small amount of customers. The Italians had armored vehicles LRB, a small number of both 335 pounds light and M1139 medium tanks RRB artillery, and most important, superior air support. If hypotheses may be drawn from knowledge of other deep-sea cephalopods, the vampire squid likely reproduces slowly by way of a small number of large eggs. Similar to many first-person shooter games, Nukem encounters a large number of weaker enemies and a small number of boss enemies LRB, extremely powerful RRB. Only a small number of slaves already behind Union lines were immediately freed. As Union forces advanced, nearly all 4 million slaves were effectively freed. Back in America, the scene had still not progressed beyond a small number of clubs in Chicago, Detroit, Newark and New York City. Who was a pioneer of the genre in the UK? Back in America, the scene had still not progressed beyond a small number of clubs in Chicago, Detroit, Newark and New York City. Who was a pioneer of the genre in America? Insects may be found in nearly all environments, although only a small number of species reside in the oceans, a habitat dominated by another arthropod group, crustaceans. Back in America, the scene had still not progressed beyond a small number of clubs in Chicago, Detroit, Newark and New York City. What new influences led to a new bass sound? When the key is near the top of the circle LRB, a key signature of 0 or few accidentals RRB, the writing of both keys is easy. A small number of extra sharps or flats is added. Back in America, the scene had still not progressed beyond a small number of clubs in Chicago, Detroit, Newark and New York City. What was a top club for house music in New York City? LRB citation needed RRB. It is speculated that these would allow for the evacuation of a small number of randomly chosen civilians in addition to most of the elite military personnel. The city's commercial districts are composed mostly of 2 to 4-story structures, although downtown and the area near Briarwood Mall contain a small number of high-rise buildings. Why DNA studies tend to imply a small number of founders and an old population whose members parted and followed different migration paths? Which lineages are generally more heterogeneous? In his second-to-last year at Winchester, he was introduced to rock climbing and mountaineering by a master R.L.G. Irving, who took a small number of pupils climbing in the Alps every year. But a small number of them did. From a small number of extremists. A small number of people in their localities. Guided by a small number of simple principles. A small number of girls were pulled from the main group, and will be completely everywhere in a small number of years. But let's think about this. How can you make a small number of neurons do a lot? At E3 2005, Nintendo released a small number of Nintendo DS game cards containing a preview trailer for Twilight Princess. Back in America, the scene had still not progressed beyond a small number of clubs in Chicago, Detroit, Newark and New York City. Initially, the OSO was tasked with spying and subversion overseas with a budget of $15 million, the largesse of a small number of patrons in Congress. Thank you for watching. Here are a couple of videos that I suggest you watch next. Before you move on to next video, if you find this video helpful, please make sure that you are subscribed to my channel. Just click the link in the description below and enable all notifications. You will be notified whenever I upload my next video. Thank you so much. See you soon.